Thank you again, Mr. Greider. There are quite a few in the audience today who were in Houston last week and heard Mr. Taylor give a message on, of all subjects, tithing. So today was when I was planning to give part 2 of my tithing messages, but actually it ends up being part 3 now, since for those of you that heard Mr. Taylor last week. But I wanted to continue with that discussion today because as we talked last time, we hit on the main scriptures or the key scriptures that we see in God's Word that deal with the basics of tithing, the history behind tithing, why we tithe today in the New Testament church as we looked at Melchizedek, changing to the Levitical, and then back to the Melchizedek priesthood with Christ in that position now as high priest. So we went through all of that, but we didn't get into some of the specifics. And a lot of folks from time to time wonder, well, should we discuss some of the specifics from the pulpit? I wanted to cover some of those today because it's always intrigued me how I get questions from time to time about some of these questions that we introduced last week. So I thought it would be good, as best as I can, to talk about some of these general principles with respect to tithing of questions that arise. Now, with anything, there are specific kinds of situations to address that we just cannot get into here. And each of us, I wouldn't say necessarily each of us, but there are probably quite a few in here who have all kinds of different situations in terms of financially where individual questions may arise. We'll talk about the principles of the general aspects of tithing today, but some of those specific details we won't get into. And if you have questions, of course, please come to me, talk with me, and be happy to talk with you, and probably send you on to someone else who knows a little bit more in these areas than I do. But I know I will try to help you as best I can if there are specific questions which do arise. You know, last time when we covered the situation a couple of weeks ago, we looked at several reasons for it, and Mr. Taylor brought out these as well. One that he emphasized as well is that tithing is a way for us to worship and recognize God. This is serious business. It is a means of worship. It's a means of our recognizing who this great God is, and not tithing is stealing from Him. It is a process that we go through that is also attached to blessings in many aspects. And tithes and offerings are the means by which the work of the church is accomplished, to serve the brethren and strengthen the brethren and the various situations that brethren are in within the church, and also to preach the gospel message to the world. So let's address some of the more specific questions today. We're going to hit some of them a bit randomly. Others will kind of flow into other ones, but let's hit about 5 or 6 today, depending on the time that we have. One of the things that we talked about last time that we didn't get into in detail deals with the question of increase. Okay, what is increase? Let's begin by going to Deuteronomy 14. Some of these passages will be very familiar to us as we hear these read as we prepare for the feast. Of course, Deuteronomy 14 is speaking about second and a little bit later even about third tithe, but a principle of tithing is addressed here in Deuteronomy 14 verse 22. Let's look at that. Deuteronomy 14 verse 22. Several things are going on here in this little verse. You shall truly tithe all the increase of your grain that the field produces year by year. Now, I heard from a member recently that there was a minister who gave an entire sermon on the subject of increase. So there is a lot to be said about increase. I will hit just some of the highlights of that today. But from the Greek, the Hebrew TBUAH, the pronunciation in Strong's is tabuah, not to be confused with Tim Tebow, tabuah, tabuah, I think is how it's pronounced. But the definition is income that is produce literally or figuratively, fruit, grain, increase, or revenue. So the revenue that is brought in, produce, fruit, grain, gains in that respect, gains that are coming in, increase in a revenue. From our old letter answer series, back in Worldwide Church of God days, we had a letter answer series for a lot of the general questions that would come in. They could just, boom, have this letter that was printed and send it to the questioner. It answers it in this way, this thing of increase. The adjusted income that comes to us as a result of our own productive efforts. That's an important statement that we'll come to in a little bit, but as a result of our own productive efforts. In other words, it is income that we earn ourselves. Therefore, unearned income, such as Social Security, old age assistance, unemployment compensation, pensions, gifts, disability, and the like, need not be tithed. But of course, you are certainly free to tithe or give offerings from such income, as long as doing so does not jeopardize your finances. Okay, so I receive Social Security. That's my only amount that I receive for sustenance. It's not a tithable. It's not as a result of my own productive efforts that I'm receiving this. I am receiving this for subsistence, but I feel a need to tithe upon that. So as a result of tithing upon that, I put myself in such a situation that I need to contact the church and ask for assistance. That's in a sense what it's saying here. It is not a tithable. It's not tithable and considered as a result of our productive efforts. So if we're in the situation where we would say, okay, I'm getting this, I would like to set aside an offering based on what I receive, free to do that, but it is not a tithable type of income in that respect. Continuing with the thought, tithable income would also include such sources as, now this is things that are tithable. Investment property. I have labored to invest in this, and as a result of this investment property, I am receiving a return on this. Capital gains from investment property, dividends from stocks, and interest from bank accounts. It does not include Social Security benefits, welfare pensions, gifts, or loans that must be repaid. A farmer or person in business should tithe on the income from the business or crops after operating expenses are deducted, but not personal living expenses. It's operating expenses of my efforts in that respect. Also, the value of products used out of the garden or field should be included in figuring total income. Okay, so if I am in a situation where I have a garden and I till this garden and it produces fruit for me, it produces vegetables that I enjoy and eat, it's speaking now of that. The value of garden produce should be figured according to the wholesale price, the price you would receive if you sold it. Again, after operating expenses are met. What it costs for me with the seed to plant this, the watering, all of those kinds of things, the effort that I put in and the cost that I expended, then the return that I get is after that's taken out, that increase, and then that amount would be tithed upon. The increase of your grain that the field produces year by year. I would like to comment with respect to this on a couple of from a couple of commentaries, and with commentaries, I know we have to be careful because it's this guy's opinion of what this is saying. But in this case, I think what both of these commentaries do is bring out little nuances of what the Scripture is also saying with respect to tithing for us to consider. John Gill's exposition of the entire Bible states this with respect to that the field brings forth year by year. Meaning being plowed and sowed yearly. The produce of it was to be tithed yearly. They state that it must be what the earth produces and is fit for food. It must be thy seed, which is especially yours and not common to others, but has an owner. And this excludes, this excludes mushrooms. Okay, so I don't know if any of you did mushroom hunting. I never did mushroom hunting till I was in high school, and my dad all of a sudden got into these little sponges, these little stick sponges that just really, in my opinion, they look very gnarly. But we would go out into our little woods and hunt for these sponges, and then I smelled them, and then I smelled them in a fryer. I thought, I cannot eat these, but my dad loved these. But so we're going out and we're finding some sponge mushrooms out in this woods and eating. That's not a situation that's ours, and we have worked and tilled and labored in this, and then accepting the increase. It's some sponges that frankly I didn't even know if they were poison or not, so I stayed away from them. But that's not something that you would tithe upon, but has an owner, which you sow not, and therefore cannot be called your seed. So that's one element. Another element is brought out in Matthew Henry's commentary. He makes this statement. When you come back and look at verse 22 again, and he says, "You," meaning each of us who are responsible for tithing, "we shall truly tithe on the increase of our grain." Henry brings out this statement. He says, "The Levites took care of their own." The tithe is what they're given, but the separating of this of the tithe to give to the Levites was left to the owners themselves. The law encouraging them to be honest, each individual to be honest, by reposing a confidence in them, and so trying their fear of God. They are commanded to tithe truly, that is, to be sure to do it, and to do it faithfully and carefully, that God's part might not be diminished either by design or by oversight. Note, he says, we must be sure to give God his full dues out of our estates for being but stewards of them. As Mr. Taylor mentioned in a big point of his message last week was everything is God's. God owns all, and he gives us what he gives us, and of what he gives us, that he owns all, he says, I just want a tithe. I want a tenth. So we see the focus also being of it is on each of us individually, is upon each of us to give that tithe. It is a very personal situation between you and your Creator in terms of the way in which you tithe. Okay, let's go back to Deuteronomy 12 and speak a little bit more about this thing of the labor that we put into it in looking at the whole understanding of increase. Deuteronomy 12, verse 7 makes this statement. This, in effect, is dealing with the second tithe as well, but it's a tithing principle. Verse 7, "You shall eat before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice in all which you have put your hand. You shall rejoice in all to which you have put your hand, you and your households." It's effort, it's labor, and that is coming back to God in terms of tithes. Nehemiah 10, two other passages with respect to this point, and then we'll move on. Nehemiah 10, let's go there. Nehemiah set many things right there in Jerusalem. We read a passage about tithing last time. We'll read a different passage today. Nehemiah 10, verse 35. Nehemiah 10, verse 35, he states, "And we made ordinances to bring the firstfruits of our ground and the firstfruits of all fruit of all the trees, year by year, to the house of the Lord, to bring the firstborn of our sons and our cattle, as it is written in the law, and the firstborn of our herds and our flocks to the house of our God, to the priests who minister in the house of God, to bring the firstfruits of our dough, our offerings, the fruit from all kinds of trees, the new wine, the oil to the priests, to the storerooms, to the house of our God, and to bring the tithes of our land to the Levites. For the Levites should receive the tithes in all our farming communities." The Authorized King James Version, I believe, says, "in all the cities of our tillage." Again, so it's coming back to we have planted these things. We have the fruit trees. We have the grains. We have these harvests. we have the animals that we've cared for, and it is as a result of our labor we're getting this increase. We are to bring a tithe in that respect. Okay, so finally, with respect to this point, let's go to 2 Chronicles 31:5. We'll just read one passage out of here and come back to it later in the message. But speaking to this particular point, we know that, as we read last time, we are to honor the Lord with our possessions, with the first fruits of our increase, as Proverbs tells us. But 2 Chronicles mentions another aspect of this that is talked about in Hezekiah's reforms with tithing. 2 Chronicles 31:5, he says, as soon as the commandment was circulated, the children of Israel, back to verse 4 of the command to contribute support, according to the priests can devote themselves to the law of the Lord. So as soon as the commandment was circulated, the children of Israel brought in abundance the first fruits of grain and wine, oil and honey, and of all the produce of the field, and they brought in abundantly the tithe of everything. It doesn't say stingily, if that's a word, but it was abundant. The tithe itself they gave in an abundant manner to the household of Levi in terms of getting the things rolling that they needed to do. So we come to this other element then of the question of what is one's increase in the area of net and gross. We'll get to that in a second, but prior to getting into that, one thing that we said last time that I want to reiterate again, in terms of getting our increase, in terms of getting our check, when is the best time to pay that? Those of us who work for employers, who are paid regularly, I just cannot emphasize enough, the best thing to do is when you get that check, when you get that and make the determination of your tithes, it is best to send that then. You get it taken care of, it's done, and it doesn't have a hope of getting confused with anything else in terms of my finances. I am taking care of it. I am giving the Lord his tenth. Self-employed people, though, are in a different situations. They experience sometimes significant fluctuations in income at different times during the year, and the expenses may not be able to be accurately figured until later in the year, maybe not even until the end of the year when everything, operating expenses, income taken in, is all set up. In some situations, people in that situations send in that tithe once a year. Others can do it quarterly. Others can do it a little more frequently. I talked to a person today who is in his own employ, and as soon as he gets money from a job that he's done, he's got immediately his operating expenses. He calculates that and then looks at the rest of what he got that is his increase, and boom, he just takes care of it almost by the job of what his tithe is and just gets it and knocks it out. Each individual situation for those of us who are self-employed is a little bit different, but the key is that we are faithful in that and that we turn our tithe in abundantly, the tithe of everything. Okay, let's talk then secondly about what about tithing on the net or tithing on the gross. Most of us understand that. Of course, in high school, I didn't understand what gross was except, that's gross. I didn't get the concept. It took college, backwoods Ohio, it took college before I understood what gross was. But gross is the amount of money that we receive or that we see on our paycheck prior to taxes and other items being taken out. The net is what we receive. It's actually our take-home pay after all of these other things are dealt with. So what is the situation on that with tithing on the net or tithing on the gross? This is a question that comes up from time to time, and I think it's worth addressing here for clarification. I have a statement from our previous affiliation, United Church of God. This statement on tithing, on tithing on the net versus the gross was outlined in 1996, and I'm sure there are some who are in this audience today who were a part of putting that document together. but that was stated fairly quickly at United's inception. Those of us who had been around prior to that, in the early to mid-90s, we're hearing the statements that tithing is no longer necessary. It's New Testament-wise, we no longer need to tithe. Tithing has been done away with, so it's just a matter of if you'd like to give an offering, give an offering. But, if a good kind of ballpark amount would be maybe somewhere around 9 or 10% or so. It's basically they wanted the same amount to come in, but tithing's not required. And of course, when the split happened, and one of the foundational things that they wanted to do was to establish, not necessarily establish that doctrine, but reconfirm that we believe in tithing. We believe that is something that the New Testament church did, and what we should, as God's people, continue to do. But then this other question came up about tithing on the net versus tithing on the gross. And I think it would probably be best for me to just read what that statement was at the time. As a result of questions about the administration of tithing, the Council of Elders has approved the following statement. This statement deals with an administrative area, tithing on net income, but not necessarily the doctrinal aspects of tithing. The church is committed to the belief that tithing is commanded for Christians today, and they cite Matthew 23:23, you tithe on this, this, and this, but you neglect the weightier matters of the law. Okay, so the Church of God has needed to make decisions from time to time regarding the administration of tithing. There are many factors that demand such decisions be made. Our modern world creates situations and circumstances which require that we address how to administer the doctrine of tithing. In 1982, Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong came to the conclusion that since brethren in various European countries had no control over the deduction of taxes from their income and derived only minimal economic benefit from payment of such taxes. I'm paying 50, 60, 70% of my gross income is going into taxes, and what I'm getting back is only a minimal return that comes back for my benefit. Most of it is going to all of these things over which I have no control, is what they're getting at. He says, so in that, because they derived only minimal economic benefit from payment of such taxes, the taxes withheld should not be considered increase for the purpose of tithing. Is that person really increasing in that gross amount that is listed there? Well, no, all he is receiving is way down here, this amount. This is really only his increase because he's not getting anything from this. He's getting very, very little return from this huge amount that's being taken out involuntarily. So he says, Mr. Armstrong subsequently applied this principle to other nations. And then they say, our modern system of economics is quite different from that of biblical times. Furthermore, our system of taxation has a greater impact on wages and salaries than in previous ages. If we take into account the various forms of taxation, such as income tax, sales tax, value-added tax, property tax, Social Security, Medicare, all of these kinds of things, the burden is often oppressive. The church recognizes the confiscatory nature of such taxation. Therefore, the Council of Elders has adopted the following proposal. While the church acknowledges the validity of God's law of tithing, it also recognizes the excessive levels of taxation and their impact on individual incomes. The church believes that the appropriate definition of increase is net income after income tax. Therefore, the church teaches that the tithe may be calculated on net income after income tax has been deducted. Of course, members are free to tithe on the gross income before income taxes are deducted if they so choose, and they are free to make contributions above their tithes as an expression of God's way of give. Now, and again, I have seen that in many individuals over the years. They've said, well, you know what? I always paid on the gross, and God blessed me so much on the gross that why do I want to switch now? I've been blessed so far beyond anything I've ever been blessed, ever hoped to be blessed with. I'm going to continue to tithe on the gross. So they do that. Others, based on this and the understanding of that, have decided to tithe on the net. That is a personal choice of each of us. The individual who decides to tithe on the gross, great. Just don't look over at that other person and says, "Oh, you're just a net tither, huh?" If you were at this level spiritually, you would be a gross tither. That sounds really gross. A tither of the gross, you would be at this level. Don't get into that kind of a situation, but to understand that it is a very personal decision that each person makes. The caveat to that is to remember that if I am an individual, well, I'll just give an example of, say for instance, you're in a country, speaking of what was being talked about, say for instance, you're in a country where you make $40,000 a year, and the government takes out 50%. Some take out higher than that, okay, 40,000. So that my take-home pay is $20,000. So then on that $20,000, I tithe my tithe, 4,000 for first, 4,000 for second, if 4,000 for third, that would have been 12,000. So 20,000 plus 12,000 takes me to 32,000. So I get a paycheck at the end of the year for $40,000, and I end up with 8,000. That's what it's getting at, the confiscatory nature of certain taxations. And in that regard, as depending on our degree of taxation, we are taxed pretty significantly here in the United States. How much of what we pay in all of these taxes that we mentioned, how much of what we pay comes back to us in terms of benefit? And the church administratively felt, in terms of recognizing all of that it is one of such that the confiscatory nature is so high that it could put people in a difficult burden to simply pay their percent in that respect. But more importantly, what it's getting at, is it truly an increase? Am I paying on what is above and beyond my actual increase? And that gets at the heart of it. That's why it comes back to this thing of what is truly an increase. God expects us to pay on our increase. Ancient Israel didn't have FICA that they paid. They didn't have Medicare. They didn't have this. They didn't have that. They didn't have property tax. They didn't have all these. They paid 10% for that. Okay, those of us that tithe on the net, what must we remember come tax return time? If you get a tax return, that tax return is on an income that we have not tithed upon. So if you get a tax return, be sure to tithe upon that. Get it? Got it? Good? We got it? Okay. So that's the aspect of it. If we tithe on the gross, then we've already tithed upon that. So when we get the tax return, it doesn't need to be tithed upon again. Okay. Let's go to a third one. We're switching gears completely before we come back to some other aspects of tithing. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 9. We introduced this subject last time and answered it by looking at Hebrews 7 with respect to the transfer of administration to the Melchizedek line, and that tithing is still going on in the New Testament. Well, what about this question that we raised? Why didn't Paul accept support? So if the Apostle Paul did not accept support, as we see from the Corinthians, why should the ministry receive payment now? There are folks that say, I'm not going to be a part of a group that pays its ministers. They need to be tent makers or make it on their own, instead of money-hungry, greedy people trying to feed off the members and milk them dry for big Cadillacs and big rings and big ties. Why should I do that? So again, I think part of that lies in a misunderstanding of what Paul is getting at in these passages. It's something worthy of addressing, in my opinion. 1 Corinthians 9, verse 1. Let's talk about where Paul states this. Verse 1, chapter 9. He says, "Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord?" He is laboring, and the members whom God brought were brought through God's using Paul in the role that he did. Verse 2, if I am not an apostle to others, yet doubtless I am to you, for you are the seal, you're the certification of my apostleship in the Lord. My defense to those who examine me is this: do we have no right to eat and drink? Do we have no right to take along a believing wife, as many were married, as do also the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord, Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I, Paul's saying, who have no right to refrain from working? Whoever goes to war at his own expense. Yeah, you can go to war and fight for this country, but you're on your own as far as living expenses and everything. Whoever does that. Who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its fruit? Who tends a flock and does not drink the milk of the flock? Do I say these things as a mere man, or does the law, important that he refers back to the law here, or does the law say the same also? For it's written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. So is God really, what's God really concerned about here? Is it really all about cows? Is it all about oxen? Of course not, he says in verse 10. Or does he say it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written, that he who plows should plow in hope, and he who threshes in hope should be partaker of his hope. Verse 11, if we have sown spiritual things for you, is it a great thing if we reap your material things? If others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? Nevertheless, we have not used this right. Paul and Barnabas, Paul is saying, we did not use this right to receive this. He says, but we endure all things lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. Well, people will say, oh, okay, so is that it? That's the essence then. You should not receive any funds because otherwise you're going to hinder the gospel of Christ. Well, does he mean that? Let's continue. Verse 13, do you not know that those who minister the holy things eat of the holy things of the temple, and those who serve at the altar partake of the offerings of the altar? Even so, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. But I have used none of these things, nor have I written these things, that it should be done so for me, for it would be better for me to die than that anyone should make my boasting void. For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for necessity is laid upon me. Yes, woe is me if I don't preach the gospel. For I do this willingly, I have a reward. But if against my will, I have been entrusted with a stewardship. What is my reward then? That when I preach the gospel, I may present the gospel of Christ without charge, that I may not abuse my authority in the gospel. So people read that, and even though he makes a case that it's valid to receive that, they come to the conclusion of what he says in verse 18. So therefore, I am not going to present the gospel and receive money. I don't want to abuse my authority in the gospel. And some read that and stop and say, there you go, then don't. Yeah, it's hard for you in this situation, but don't receive any funds. Let's go to 2 Corinthians 11 and look at the rest of the story in his, what is probably his third letter to them, as 1 Corinthians refers to a time when he has written an earlier letter. So this is probably at least the third letter here, the 2 Corinthians. But 2 Corinthians 11, verse 7, notice what Paul says here. 2 Corinthians 11, verse 7. He says, did I commit sin in humbling myself that you might be exalted, because I preached the gospel of God to you free of charge? And then here's how he says he made ends meet while he did that. Metaphorically here he says, I robbed other churches. I was taking wages from them so that I could serve you. And when I was present with you and in need, I was not going to be a burden to anyone there in Corinth. For what I lacked, the brethren who came from Macedonia supplied. And in everything I kept myself from being burdensome to you, and so I'll continue to do that. So he says, as the truth of Christ is in me, no one shall stop me from this boasting in the regions of Achaia. Why? Because I do not love you? God knows. So he's getting at the fact that, no, yes, I was receiving this income, but I wasn't receiving it from you. So Paul did take in the money and resources to be able to continue operating. He just didn't with Corinth because of the situation, the very strained situation that was going on there. We won't turn there, but Philippians 4, if you'd like to read that, Philippians 4, 10 through 20, talks about how Paul received funds and help and assistance in a variety of ways from those there in Philippi. Okay, with that said, let's jump ahead now to some other details that address second tithe. Let's look at that. The common scriptures that we turn to with respect to that are found in Deuteronomy 14 and 12. Let's go there briefly. So we have the first tithe that we talked about last time and today, this tenth, but we also have a second tithe that is kept for the feasts of the Lord, to be spent in that respect. Deuteronomy 14, verse 22, we read this every year at the feast. Truly tithe of all the increase of your grain that the field produces year by year. You shall eat before the Lord your God in the place he chooses to make his name. And he talks about the tithe of all of these areas. And part of that process is in doing so, we're learning to fear God always. If the journey's too far, so we can't carry all that tithe, we can exchange it to get funds and then take that money to the feast, to where the Lord your God chooses. Verse 26, spend that money for whatever your heart desires, oxen, sheep, wine, similar drink, for whatever your heart desires you shall eat before the Lord there and rejoice. And in doing so, he says in verse 27, what we understand to still be connected with the second tithe, he says, you shall not forsake the Levite who's within your gates, for he has no part nor inheritance with you. So the Levite is to be looked after as well with respect to the feasts. Let's go back to Deuteronomy 12. Deuteronomy 12, verse 5. Deuteronomy 12, verse 5 speaks this place of the Lord where the Lord your God chooses. Verse 6, you shall take your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, the heave offerings of your hand, your vowed offerings, firstborns of flock, and there you shall eat before the Lord. Same thing is talked about in the way in which the Lord has blessed you. Go, you keep that, you rejoice. All of the passage discusses there. We come all the way down to verse 18, but you must eat them before the Lord your God in the place which the Lord your God chooses. Do this with you and your son, your daughter, your servants, and the Levite who's within your gates. Take heed that you do not forsake the Levite as you live in the land. So there is this tithe that is set aside so they can go and keep the feast. Well, one of the reasons that we feel that the second tithe is still valid hinders upon our understanding, our New Testament understanding, not of holidays, but of holy days. We believe the New Testament church, and we see evidence of the New Testament church keeping the feasts. We see it in 1 Corinthians 5, days of unleavened bread. We see that keep the feast of unleavened bread with sincerity and truth. We see Pentecost discussed in Acts 20, verse 16, in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 8. 30 years into the church, 30 plus years, they're keeping Pentecost. Atonement has passed, as is referred to in Acts 27, verse 9. All of these different holy days were still being kept. Well, how do you keep the holy days? You keep the holy days by having the funds to go and keep the feast in the locations where the place the Lord your God shall choose. So the fact that the holy days are still going is one evidence that the tithe would still be kept, this second tithe. As we said last time, one of the critical things with us with respect to second tithe. One is this thing of setting it aside. Do not get that money mixed up with other funds. It will get you in trouble, and it has gotten people in trouble. Set that thing aside that is not touched. It is only added to throughout the year. Don't pull from that in emergency situations. It is stealing from God. The holy tithe that goes 2, the administering of the line of Melchizedek is the first tithe, and also we will talk about the third tithe here in a second. That is to be given, and there are scriptures that talk about the details of that and how God views that. But God also considers this second tithe very, very special for a designed purpose, for us to mix that. Well, I make $7.9 million a year. Well, so you tithe on that. I shouldn't have used that term because it's going to be difficult for me to calculate. So that would be $760,000 a year that I would have for second tithe. I can't spend all that, so I'll get a new car or this or that for this. No, it is for the feast. It is set aside for the feast, for that purpose. It is God has set it aside for that, and from that, in a sense, would be stealing from God as well. Okay, before we get to the third tithe, if you would like, we can go ahead and just go over a couple of verses, a couple of chapters again, back to Deuteronomy 14. Let's talk about a couple of other terms that we've referred to from time to time. Well, what is the tithe of the tithe? What is that? That's referring to the second tithe. And the second tithe that we've saved for the keeping of the feasts, to be able to appear before the Lord in the place that He chooses. A tithe of the tithe is not something that we go to Scripture and we say it's found in this particular verse in Scripture. It's an administrative decision that the church has implemented and implemented many years ago to help offset the costs of the feast sites. As I think we're very aware, as we go to keep the feast, we've got the use of the hall, we've got the facilities, we've got the various activities that are going to be run for our sakes, for our benefit. We've got senior citizens luncheons that are helped to be paid for, all kinds of different services that we're doing at the feast. The church has requested that as we set aside we have our tenth set aside for the feast, that we would, to help offset the costs, take a tenth of that tenth that we have, a tenth of that, and give that to the church to help offset the costs. And in that way, all of us are able to benefit from that amount that we give, which is part of keeping the feast. So that's the tithe of the tithe. Well, what about, again, excess festival tithe? How does that work? We announce that from time to time every year as the feast approaches. But not everybody is going to be in this situation, but again, for those of us in this congregation that make a certain amount and we're going to a certain site, when all is said and done, when we look at our expenses, some are in the situation where they say, I'm going to have a lot left over. I cannot use all of my second tithe for the feast. Maybe some of us can pretty easily. But anyway, just depending on our situations, that's the case. But I may have some left over, or I'm very confident. Some of us can go into the feast, are blessed enough financially where even going into the feast, you just know there is no way I'm going to be able to spend all of what God has blessed me with in this second tithe. So some are in a position where they can give to the office excess festival tithe, and through that means that goes into a fund to be able to help others who are not as financially well off to be able to attend the feast. We talked before about income and what is increase. A person who is receiving Social Security only, or some type of, as was mentioned in the L series letter, old age pension, that is not a tithable income. They are striving to save what they can to help them with the feast, but it's not tithable, so they're not going to have that tenth for the feast. So through our excess second tithe that we give in, that money can be apportioned to help others keep the feast, and it ends up being a tremendous blessing to others. Some, at the end or the conclusion of the feast, realize, wow, I've got this much left over, and I know I'm going to need this much to get back home, but I'm going to have this much. And some turn that in at the end of the feast. Some wait till they get home and then send that in. But it is a means through which we can help others, as we see in Deuteronomy 14. here in verse 27, don't forsake the Levite that is within your gate, and then in other passages it talks about, as we said in Deuteronomy 12, we didn't turn there, but well, we did, but actually talking about helping others keep the feast that are under our care and protection. So it offers an opportunity to help others be able to keep the feast. With that comes another question. Well, what about if I, as a member, have knowledge of a situation where someone in the congregation is very tight financially, and I have so much second tithe that I can help them? We see this a lot at the feast, and this is a beautiful thing to behold. And a person may or may not know that the person is in financial difficulties, but they say, hey, come on, we're going to go out. Come out with us. And then the bill is automatically paid, and the person, well, I want to pay. No, I got it. And people help them in that regard. Well, what about situations where a person is in difficult financial situations, and you've got you made a mere $7.6 million this past year, and you've got thousands to give away, and I'll just give $1,000 to this person. Is there a problem with that? Well, the tricky thing sometimes with, I say tricky, but some of the issues that can come up from time to time, and this has happened. It's rare in the church, but sometimes we have situations where a person hasn't been faithful in keeping his or her tithes. They have been gainfully employed, or maybe they've been underemployed, but they are working and they are receiving income. They are receiving increase from their labor, but even that, they're not faithfully tithing. Okay, so what happens then if that person who doesn't know the situation but is quite flush with dough says, oh, I'll just give that person, it looks like, I was talking with him, I could tell things were a little tight, I'll just give them $1,000 for the feast. Well, what happens in that respect then is that person who has not faithfully tithed and has not been following God's law is rewarded for something, and does that person learn his lesson? The person that's not been tithing faithfully, when he or she has been getting an income, should that person be going to the feast on somebody else's tithe when probably the best situation in that case is for that person to learn his or her lesson and save his tithes next year so he can go to the feast? So sometimes we don't always know those situations. That's why the church prefers that if we have excess, we send that into the office. The office then works through the process of helping with excess festival tithe to administer that equitably to those who are in need and who qualify to be able to receive need. I'm not saying that in no circumstances ever should there be a situation where we're giving others cash to help with the feast. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying be prudent in that regard, and if you have a question, contact one of the elders, contact one of the ministers, so that can be handled in a way that is appropriate and right and actually helps the person who is in that situation. As we mentioned before, those of us who are tithing faithfully and are underemployed, or those of us who are receiving Social Security or some of these other things that are not tithable, you may be in a position, even if you're working, you don't have enough money to be able to go to the feast. Contact the minister. Contact us early. Contact us in May, late May, early June, so we can help you get to the feast. That is our responsibility. We take that responsibility very seriously to help all those who can to attend the feast. If you are tight financially and you have faithfully tithed on tithable income and you are in need to be able to go to the feast, it is your responsibility to come to us. If we don't know, we can't help. You need to keep the feast. We want you to keep the feast. God wants you to keep the feast. Let us know so we can help you get to the feast. Okay, let's go to the third tithe. Here in Deuteronomy 14, we see a change here in discussion. Deuteronomy 14, verse 28. At the end of every third year, you shall bring out the tithe of your produce of that year and store it up within your gates. Now, some will say, okay, so see what that means is, my first 2 years I keep second tithe, but in my third year, instead of keeping the second tithe, I keep this tithe and it goes for this. It's the same tithe, but in the third year it goes for this. That's not what it's saying. It's talking about a third tithe. The other tithe, the second tithe, is kept every year. So he says, at the end of every third year, you shall bring out the tithe of your produce of that year and store it up within your gates. And the Levite, because he has no portion nor inheritance with you, the stranger, the fatherless, the widow who are within your gates may come and eat and be satisfied. And and through that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hand which you do. So now he talks about this third tithe. How do we know that it was three separate tithes? There's another passage that I'd like us to look at here in Deuteronomy 26, because I've read several online articles here or there where people say, no, it's the same tithe, it's just used for this in the third year instead of this. We see some examples in extra biblical works that support this. I'll quote from that here in just a second. But we also see a statement made in Deuteronomy 26 that's very telling with that respect, that deals with this third tithe. Deuteronomy 26, verse 12, he says here, when you have finished laying aside all the tithe of your increase in the third year, and notice the parenthetical or the statement that's set apart by these hyphens, the year of tithing. The third year, it's the year of tithing. I mean, it's the year that you're tithing a lot. It's first, second, and third tithe. The year of tithing, and have given it to the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, so that they may eat within your gates and be filled. So it's that third tithe year is for helping them. As we said, if you're making $40,000 a year, that would be in the third year. That would be that $4,000 that would go towards that. So he says, so you do that they may be filled. Then you shall say before the Lord your God, I have removed the holy tithe. The third tithe is a holy tithe from my house. And also I've given it to the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, according to all your commandments which you have commanded me. I have not transgressed your commandments, nor have I forgotten them. I have not eaten any of it when in mourning, nor have I removed any of it for an unclean use, nor have I given it for the dead. I have obeyed the voice of the Lord. I have done according to all that you've commanded me. Look down from your holy habitation, look down from heaven, and bless your people Israel in the land which you have given us, just as you swore to our fathers, a land flowing with milk and honey. This year of tithing, this third year, don't eat of it. It goes to caring for these individuals. The book of Josephus, many of you have this, the Antiquities of the Jews, but the book of Josephus speaks about this. It's in book 9, I think. No, book 11. Where is this? Find it. No, it's actually in book 4. Book 4, chapter, I think it's chapter 8, section 22. He makes note of this. He says, besides those two tithes, first and second tithe, which I've already said you are to pay every year, the one for the Levites, the first tithe, the other for the festivals, second tithe, you are to bring every third year a third tithe to be distributed to those that want, to women also that are widows, and to children that are orphans. But as to the ripe fruits, let them carry that which is ripe first of all into the temple. So he goes through and talks about these three tithes. Well, what about the third tithe system? What does the church teach about the third tithe? So the first question, is the third tithe commanded for God's people today? And the answer is yes, the third tithe is commanded. We are commanded to keep the first tithe, we are commanded to keep the second tithe, and we are commanded as God's people to keep the third tithe. They are the commands of God. That is the tithing system. Now, to the current taxation situation that we see in our nation today, that we see in various countries around the world. Let's go back to the system that God put in place back then. Okay, how much were the Israelites taxed? FICA, all of these different taxes. How much were they taxed? 0. Okay. The person who made $40,000 a year, if, again, just to put it in American dollars terms, with all the increase that I had from my field, when I switched that over to money, I made $40,000 that year. So in 3 years' time, how much should I have to pay in third tithe? $4,000, because $4,000 is first tithe, $4,000 second tithe, and then in my third year, I pay $4,000. So out of the $120,000 of increase that I have, how much does God expect me to pay in third tithe? $4,000. Okay. So we are in a different situation in terms of the governmental structure in which we find ourselves today. Here we are in America. What programs do we have in place to look out for the needy? I've got a brother-in-law who has Down syndrome. He receives a Social Security income of about $700-800 a month. Who pays for that? You do. We do. Those of us who pay taxes. That Social Security system, we are paying to care for the needy. That is going towards his sustenance. In a different situation, if it were in the ancient Levitical time of Israel, some of that third tithe would be there to help the needy. We are paying that involuntarily now in our taxation system. Now, let's talk about that amount. Okay, so God says basically out of $120,000, $4,000 would go towards third tithe in 3 years' time. So how are we taxed now? So what's the approximate taxation? When you look at property tax, depending on the value of your property, if you're a homeowner, income tax, sales tax, all the different taxes, Medicare, FICA, all of these things, how much do we pay? How much does a person making $40,000 pay in taxes? What would you say? Would you say overall 15%, 20% when you think about sales tax and all these things? Let's just say 15%. So $40,000, what's 10%? 4,000, 15% would be 6,000. So $6,000 a year that person pays in taxes. So in 3 years' time, that person has paid $18,000 for assistance and helping others with very little coming back to that individual. So what's God's plan? 4,000. What's the confiscatory nature of America? 18,000. You know, way beyond what God has set up in place for that to be able to take care of and for people to be able to be looked after. So the church looked into that, and of course, as is the case with the previous write-up on net and gross, you see the situation in other countries where it's way more than that in some cases. So the same statements that were made in 1996 the statements that were made at the same time of the other, this came out from the church at that time. The Bible teaches that Christianity involves the care and concern of those less fortunate, James 1:27. The Old Testament gives instructions regarding contributions, commonly called third tithe, for those in the community who are typically in need of financial assistance. As Deuteronomy 14 brings out. Many nations in our world have various social programs, the effect and intent of which is to fulfill the purpose of the biblical third tithe. These programs are financed by an involuntary system of taxation. In most cases, the annual rate at which social taxes are extracted is substantially greater than the biblical third tithe. In 1982, Mr. Armstrong was presented with the facts regarding this form of taxation in Britain and in Scandinavia and the impact that it had on the individual's wages in those nations. Mr. Armstrong recognized that these modern states in Europe had to a large extent assumed the church's responsibility in caring for the needy. Therefore, Mr. Armstrong made an administrative decision that members in Britain and Scandinavia did not need to pay what in effect would have been an additional third tithe to the church. It's very important, saying that third tithe is being paid. It would amount to being an additional third tithe. As Mr. Armstrong put it, the state, to a large extent, takes care of the widow, the elderly, the unemployed, the orphan, and the destitute. How do they take care of that? With the funds that people make as they pay that. We, however, pay for this through contributions deducted by the government at source. He also reminded the church that despite what national governments may do to help the disadvantaged, there may still be needs within the church that national social programs do not address. Therefore, we should from time to time, as we do today, make offerings to the church assistance fund. We have an assistance fund to which we can make offerings. Later, because the same principles applied, the same administrative decision was made for other countries in Europe and eventually for all nations in which the church had congregations except the United States. That decision was never made for the United States. Mr. Armstrong did not address the issue of third tithe for members in the United States. So at the time, as the church looked at it, they said, nevertheless, if we carefully examine the United States Social Security system and other welfare programs funded by taxation in the U.S., we readily see that the principle regarding the administration of third tithe that applies internationally applies to the U.S. as well. And at no time did Mr. Armstrong deny the biblical teaching of the third tithe, nor the church's responsibility to take care of its needy. On the contrary, he stressed the need for members to continue to support the church assistance fund. However, he did recognize that the amount members would have paid in third tithe and more was in fact taken from them to fund these national programs. Therefore, he ruled that members did not need to pay what in effect was an additional third tithe to the church when governments were taxing them and using that tax for the same intent and purpose as the biblical third tithe. So that has been the position of the church. Now, what if you are in the situation where you say, okay, I recognize this, I know this, I have known this, but I am paying third tithe, and in my third tithe year, I find that it's always worked out. I've been blessed, and I feel that despite that, I want to and believe I should pay third tithe. So be it. Continue to do it. If that whatsoever is not of faith is sin. As I think I told you before, let's turn finally, if we could, over to 2 Chronicles 31 as we bring this to a close. I think I told you this, but my dad had started tithing when he came into the church, and back then we tithed on the gross, and first, second, third tithe, and he was a little stressed coming up to the third tithe year, but everything worked out so well that year. He felt like, man, we had so many other blessings. I'm going to third tithe every year. And he was so excited, and happened to be talking to another person at church and told the guy, and he wasn't doing it to brag, but he said, man, this has just been an incredible year. I'm just going to third tithe. I'm just going to keep third tithing. So anyway, I think the member was a little concerned that the Burnett family was off its rocker, which we probably were and probably still are to this day. But anyway, so he went and talked to the minister, and the minister came back and said, Larry, the Bible says the third tithe is in the third and the sixth year. You've got the year of release, and then you don't need to do that. So my dad said, okay, I won't. But he set aside the third tithe still for all church activities. So when it wasn't the third tithe year, he still had that money there. So for all the church activities that we did, all the sports, all the different things that were going, he used that money for those events. But it was one of those things where he said this has been a great blessing for us, and some are in that situation today that they feel this is what I've done, this is what I've always done, this is the way I view this based on this. Some look at situations and say, well, you know what, it's a government, and what does God have to do with the government? I feel I should pay this third tithe because this is how I view this, regardless of what the government takes out. If so be it. Don't wear that as your banner of righteousness if that's what you decide to do. Look at this guy over here, this net tither, and this doesn't send in third tithe like I do. That's where we get into problems. But if it is a matter of faith and conviction, by all means, go ahead and follow through with that. Again, the caveat with that is we still have a responsibility to look after the needs of those in the church who need help beyond what is offered by the government, and to the degree which we can help, we ought to be in a position to give. Okay, so finally in 2 Chronicles 31, I want to read a statement. We did not get into today explanations of tithing on the increase with respect to certain aspects of retirement and all of the different holdings that different people have. And there may be many here that are in various kinds of financial situations where you're receiving revenues from this and that. I mean, we could try to get into that, but it can get so detailed that as a caveat, I wrote one of the individuals who's been in the ministry for many years about a question years ago with respect to this, and the fellow wrote back and said, listen, we could write so many things that it would be like the Talmud itself in terms of what is to be tithed upon and not. And he said it comes back to that general principle of what tithing is. It is giving a tenth of our increase. And secondly, that it is a very personal situation between that person and his maker. That's where it rests ultimately. If you have specific questions of just wanting guidance and direction and maybe just to bounce off some ideas about thinking through the various ways of income that you receive, how those things should be tithed upon, then seek counsel, and in that way there is safety in that counsel. So that be it as it may, it is still a very, very personal relationship with our God and our Maker. As we conclude, let's look at 2 Chronicles 31. We read this either last spring or the spring before in looking at the reforms of Hezekiah, but I find it really encouraging how God looked upon the diligence that Hezekiah and the people had put forth in their giving abundantly of this tithe, as well as the other areas of worship that the people put their hearts into. Coming down to verse 10. Make sure I got it here. Yeah, verse 8, 2 Chronicles 31, verse 8, he says, and when Hezekiah and the leaders came and saw the heaps, they said the heaps of, the tithe of everything, all this that had been brought in, this amount that they had brought in as they finished the 7th month, the Feast of Ingathering, all these tithes came in. So they see these humps here, heaps and humps of massive areas of grain and food. They blessed the Lord and his people Israel. Verse 9, then Hezekiah questioned the priests and the Levites concerning these heaps of all these grains and everything, produce that had come in. And Azariah, the chief priest from the house of Zadok, answered him and said, since the people began to bring the offerings into the house of the Lord, we've had enough to eat and we have plenty left. And the Lord has blessed his people. And what is left is this great abundance. Again, reflecting back on what we read a couple of weeks ago in Malachi 3. Try me in this, God says. Try me. Test me in this. See if I don't bless you, beyond your ability to even take it all in. So he says, it's this great abundance. So reflecting on that, we go to verses 20 and 21 then. Thus Hezekiah, in what he did this throughout all of Judah. And he did what was good, he did what was right, and he did what was true before the Lord his God. And what happened? And in every work that he began in the service of the house of God, in the law and in the commandment to seek his God, he did it with all his heart. And that is the same principle that takes place with this understanding of tithing.